Hello, and welcome to the next video in this series of Intro to Creative Coding, Intro to Creative Web Dev that I've been doing. Over the last few weeks, you've learned quite a bit. You've learned about P5 and calling functions to draw shapes, and you learned about using variables like the width and height variables to get information from the computer. And then you learned about creating your own variables to sort of store data in your code. And in the last video, you learned about if statements, which let you make decisions in your code. This video sort of uses all of those to introduce sort of a tangible, like what you can do with all of that, and that is creating an animation. So before I get into the sort of code of it all, I want to talk about animation kind of very generally. So I don't know if people even remember what this is anymore, but back in the day, movies were recorded on film strips. I think generally they're digital now, but back in the day, this is how movies worked, or TV shows, or cartoons, any of the above. Um, they were a series of photographs, basically, where each photograph was one frame of the movie, or of the TV show, or of the cartoon, and by showing those frames very quickly, you could create, the animation effect. So I'm guessing that y'all have probably seen a film strip before, or you know what it is. But here's an example that I pulled from some art I did. Where I basically took every frame from a movie and digitally stitched them together to create this kind of poster. And this is Moana. So I don't know, if I zoom in, you can kind of see the individual frames. So you can see that this is, someone kind of talking, and it's just a bunch of pictures of the person's face, but it moves just a little tiny bit, and it's kind of blurry here because I used this for a poster that, each one's really tiny. But the idea is that each frame is sort of a standalone image, but because those images are shown sort of one after another in sequence, they add up to this animation. So actually, here's one. I don't know if you can see this. Maybe make the window full screen, the video full screen for this part. But right here, you can kind of see that there's a frame, and it's kind of some leaves or something. And then the next one is mostly leaves, and then you see someone kind of poking their head out, and then someone emerges from the leaves. And we can look at these images and we can see each individual image, but if you were to display them one after the other, you would see a video of someone sort of emerging from the leaves in this very specific example. But very generally, that's how animation works. You show a series of still images that sort of add up to the overall effect. So, for example, let me go to, like, I don't know, beautiful Microsoft Paint and just kind of draw an example myself. Let's say I want to draw a circle that drops from the top of the screen. So I might do that by, I don't know, maybe I'll start by drawing a background of gray, and then I will maybe draw a circle towards the top somewhere. And sure, good enough. And by itself, this is just a picture. This is just an image. It's not moving. It's not magically a movie or anything. And in fact, there's no inherent meaning to anything here. This could be a ball, but it could be, I don't know, a moon or a sun, or it could be the start of a stick figure that I'm going to draw. It could be really anything. There's no inherent meaning to each individual image. But let's see what happens if I create like another image, and I'll sort of start, actually maybe I'll start from scratch. So I'm going to draw gray. I think that's the same color. We're going to find out in a second. And maybe I'll draw another circle sort of lower in the screen, and I'll put it right there or so. And again, by itself, there's no meaning here. There's no motion. There's no anything. It's just a circle in the middle of a gray rectangle. And let me open up another sort of blank canvas here, and I'll draw my gray background, and I'll draw my circle as well, and I'll draw this one sort of at the bottom. And again, there's no motion here. It's just a circle with a gray background. But where the magic comes in is if I show you these images sort of one after the other, kind of in a quick sequence, your brain will fill in the blanks. So I'm going to start with my first image here, and there's a circle at the top, and I'll go to my second image, and maybe my centering was a little off, so maybe I'll fix that a little bit. But the idea is that if I show you these images one after the other, your brain will pattern recognize that this is a ball falling. And this is what animation is. This is showing a still image that by itself doesn't have any meaning, but because you're showing a bunch of them in order where something changes from one to the other, from one to the next, your human brain will fill in the gaps. It'll fill in the blanks, and it'll say, oh, actually, what this is a ball falling from the sky. Or whatever it is that you're drawing. In this case, I'm drawing a circle. So your brain fills in the blanks, and so that's the sort of trick of animation. Is it's your brain filling in the gaps. So okay, that's what animation is at a very high level without really thinking about computers. It's drawing a bunch of images, changing stuff from one image to the other, and seeing a pattern or an animation that sort of emerges from that. So next, let's talk about how to actually do that in code. So let me open up the P5 editor, and I'm gonna zoom in. Yeah, okay. And this is the plain old P5 editor that we've come to know and love. And let me talk about a couple things that kind of build on what we've already learned about. So I want to introduce a word called state. And state is kind of a fancy computer science word that means all of the variables in your sketch and their current values. So for example, I don't know, let me create a variable up here, and I'll call it, like, spoiler alert, I'll call it circle y, and I'll set it equal to a value. And then maybe down here, I will use that to draw my circle. So I'll say circle, and maybe I'll draw it at width over 2, and circle y, and maybe I'll give it a size of 100. So I'll run that, and there's my circle. And all of this uses concepts that you've learned previously. I'm creating a variable, and then I'm calling a function and passing it in some parameters. Some of them are based on the width variable. One of them is based on the variable that I created above, and then a hard-coded number for the size. And so the idea of state is it's here. In this case, my state is a single variable called circle y holding a value of 100. And so you can think of, as you think of frames, as you start thinking in terms of frames, think about how your state will change from one frame to another. And I find that that's kind of a helpful way to think about it. Okay, so that being said, let me talk about a couple things that you might have seen before, but I didn't actually explicitly call them out. So let me do that now. So one of them is the idea of reassigning a variable. So right now I have a single variable called circle y, and that circle y variable holds or points to a value of 100. I can change that. I can reassign it. So by default, I have assigned it to 100, but there's nothing stopping me from saying, actually, circle y should equal 200. So this line of code here takes the circle y variable and sets it equal to 200. So if we read the code kind of line by line, what happens is first, because I'm using the let keyword, I create a variable called circle y, and I set it equal to 100. Then I create my canvas. Then I draw a background of gray in this case. And then I reassign the circle y variable to 200, and then I draw my circle. And I draw my circle using that circle y variable. So let me run this. And hopefully you noticed that the circle kind of moved because the circle y is now 200 instead of 100. So you can reassign or overwrite the idea of, or the previous value of a variable. The other thing I can do, and let me kind of move this code around. Let me not put it here. Let me put it here. It kind of doesn't matter, but this will help me later. I'm going to put it here. The other thing I can do is I'm going to modify the value of my variable. I'm going to reassign my variable to a new value, but that value is going to be based on the current value. And so that might be a little confusing. So maybe just to set it up a little bit, I can reassign the value of my variable to anything. This can be anything. And it can be a number, like I did before, where I did 200. So in this case, nothing should change. It could be using other variables. So I could do maybe like height over 2 plus 100. I'll run that, and that works. Now here's the sort of magic, the new piece that if you're kind of new to thinking in terms of state, this might be a little bit mind-blowing. So what I'm going to do is take the circle y variable, and I'm going to reassign it to whatever the circle y variable currently is, plus some number. In this case, I'll just kind of arbitrarily choose 100. And so, again, reading through the code line by line, what's happening is first I create a variable called circle y, and I set it equal to the value 100. Then I create a canvas, which makes me, gives me my square. And then I tell P5 to take the circle y variable and assign it to whatever the current circle y value is, which in this case is 100 plus 100. So it'll in the end equal 200. So let me run that. And yeah, now we're sort of right in the middle because 200 is the same as like height over 2. But I can change this, I can change this to whatever number I want, really. So you can see here that circle y the circle's kind of down at the bottom because circle y is whatever circle y was, which is 100, plus 250, which is 350, which is kind of, down at the bottom since my canvas has a height of 400. Okay, so that is reassigning variables and modifying variables by reassigning them to their old value plus some other number. There are other ways to do it, but or the things you can do with that. But for now, I'm thinking in terms of just adding stuff to my previous variable. Now, here's where all of this gets interesting or useful, and that is yet another thing that I've sort of talked about in the previous videos, but I haven't really explicitly taken advantage of very well yet, and that is the fact that the draw function is called automatically 60 times a second. And let me maybe pause and really talk about that, because up until this point, I've been completely pretending that this stuff didn't exist. So let me get rid of, let me keep it actually. So there's two main sections of code that you've been staring at for the last few weeks. One is setup, and P5 runs whatever code is in setup one time, right at the very beginning of your sketch. So in here, this is where you put stuff that you only want to happen once. So this is where you create your canvas. Eventually, this is where you'll do stuff like load images or things that you only really want to do one time. And then P5 will run whatever's inside your draw section or your draw function. It'll run this code 60 times a second. And up until this point, that has not mattered because for the most part, we've been just drawing the same thing every frame, every time draw is called. And so 60 times a second, you're drawing a flower, which doesn't move around, and you just end up seeing the same thing over and over again. We did play a little bit with random, but I haven't really talked too much more about it than that. So why I'm talking about this in such detail is you can take advantage of those two sort of concepts. The first concept being the idea of reassigning a variable, and the second concept being the idea that draw is called 60 times a second to create animations. So I'm going to kind of steal this line of code. I'm actually going to just delete it because I want to rewrite it from scratch just because it's kind of important and new. And so let me think about this. Maybe I'll do it this way. In draw, right now, I'm drawing a background and then I'm drawing a circle. And I could just run this and just confirm that that's still working. And now here's the sort of magic part. What I want to do is take the circle y function, or the circle y variable, and I want to reassign it to whatever circle y was before, which in this case it started out as 100, and I'm going to add maybe 1 to it for now, and then I'm going to run it. But before that, I want to maybe just talk about it for 1 second. So in the draw function, which is called 60 times a second, I am first going to draw a background, then I'm going to draw a circle using that circle y variable, and then I am going to add 1 to circle y. Okay, now I'm going to run this. And you see that this is creating an animation because every frame, at the end of my frame, I am changing the circle y variable, or you can think of it as I am updating the state of my sketch. And so since the state of my sketch is changing just a little bit every time, you are creating kind of like a film strip, which creates the animation that you are seeing. I can maybe make this a little bit more obvious. Maybe if I slow down the frame rate to like 1, and then let me just keep it that way. It might end up being too slow, but let's try it and see what happens. So now yeah, it's way too slow. I slowed it down to, instead of calling draw 60 times a second, instead of running this code 60 times per second, it's just once per second. That's what this frame rate function does. And I will maybe just say that if you want more information about that, check out your best friend, the P5 reference. If I look at frame rate, this will tell me more info, and yeah, all good. But I'm just kind of cheating right now and just saying frame rate of 1 just to show it in more detail. And it's super slow, so let me maybe speed it up a little bit. Okay, so now once per second, what I'm doing is I'm drawing a background, in this case gray, then I'm drawing a circle with my circle y variable, and then I'm adding 10 to my circle y variable, which, because my frame rate is so slow, it's a little bit more obvious now what's happening, where each frame is showing the circle, but because each frame has the circle kind of moving a little bit each time, your brain kind of fills in those gaps, and your brain sees a falling circle. So, you can experiment with that. You can experiment with frame rate and how much you change variables over time. Usually what you want is a pretty high frame rate. 60 will get us, everything we need in this class, and then changing things kind of as little as you can to make that kind of smooth, smooth animation. And you can speed it up if you want, all good. But the idea is that you are changing the state of your sketch by updating the value that variables point to, and then using those variables to draw your sketch. Okay. One thing I do want to talk about, because it's a little different, it's easy to miss, and it's super important, is the idea of scope. And again, I've kind of breezed past this in previous weeks because we haven't really needed it. It hasn't really been, I could tell you about it, but there would be no point because it wouldn't change the code you were writing. But now I'm going to talk about it because very likely you'll run into some problems with it. And that is the idea of scope. And scope is another, it's a fancy computer science word that means when can you use a variable. And long story short, you can use a variable inside of whatever curly brackets you created your variable in. So for example, let me do something like this. Let me move this line of code to, I don't know, here. And this will probably match some of the code that you've already written in the previous tutorials. I would generally put, the creation of variables down here in the draw function. But let's take a look at what happens when I make that change. So what happens is a very disappointing, my circle is not moving. And this is going to be a very common kind of error case to be in. And what's happening is, let's read through the code line by line. In my draw function, which is called 60 times a second, first I create a circle y variable named circle y that points to a value of 100. Then I draw a background. Then I draw my circle. Then I add 1 to my circle y variable, just like I was before. Okay, cool. Then draw is called again. 1/60th of a second later, draw is called again. And what do? I create a variable named circle y, and I point it to a value of 100. And then I draw a background, I draw my circle at 100, then I add 1 to that previous value. Now the problem here is that I'm never actually, I'm not remembering this value. Because I'm recreating the variable every time or every frame, then this P5 won't remember this the next frame. So the next frame comes around and I say, ooh, you've told me to create a new variable called circle y, set it equal to 100. So the scope of this variable is sort of too narrow. So you need to create it in an outer scope, in a larger scope, outside of the draw function. The other thing that you might try is creating it inside of the setup function. And let me just see what happens if I do that. If I run that, then you get an error message. And that's because, let's read through the code line by line. In the setup function, which is called one time at the very beginning, I create my canvas, and then I create a new variable called circle y, and I set it equal to the value of 100. Now, I said a couple minutes ago that a variable is in scope, or you are allowed to use a variable sort of inside the curly brackets of wherever it is. So in this case, the curly brackets are the setup function, so I am allowed to use that variable inside the setup function. The problem is that when I get down to my draw function, I am no longer inside those curly brackets, so circle y is now out of scope. I'm not allowed to use it anymore, which is what's causing this error. So all of that being said, what I would encourage you to do from now on is create any of your variables at the very top. And this will help you kind of keep track of the state because they're all sort of at the top. And as your code gets more complicated, having them all at the top is a good way to remind yourself of the kinds of things that your code does. And I'll talk about that as this video goes on. But now I'm back to having a working sketch. Another thing that's very common with these variables in this scope is to do kind of a mix of all of the above. So what I'm going to do is create a variable called circle y at the very top. So I'm creating this, I call it like a sketch level variable because it's sort of right at the top. So that means I can use it pretty much anywhere. I'm creating the variable, but I'm not yet setting it equal to anything. I'm not assigning it a value yet. And then in the setup function, now I give it a value. So maybe I'll set it equal to height over 2. And then I use it in draw. So I create it up top at the sketch level, outside of all of my functions. Don't give it a value yet. Then in setup, I assign it a value. This could be height over 2. This could be 200, whatever. And then in the draw function, then I use it to draw my circle, and then I reassign it by adding 1 to it. And this is a super common pattern because there are variables, specifically width and height, and there are functions and stuff that you can't use up here. So to get around that, you put it down here. Maybe I should actually show you what that looks like. If you tried to use height up there, something would break. Let's see. So let me run this, and yeah, everything's broken. Because I am trying to use the height variable before my canvas is created, this breaks down. So that's why that pattern of creating your variables up here and then assigning them down here in setup is so common. So sure, I'll set it equal to height over 2, and then I use the variable in draw, and all of that's fine because I have created or declared my variable at the very top. So now I run this, and now it's working. Cool. Okay, so now we know the fundamentals of using P5, creating a variable at the top so that it's in scope in both setup and draw, and maybe assigning it a value in setup, and then using that variable to draw a shape or several shapes in draw, and then finally reassigning or modifying that variable at the end of draw to change it over time. And that's all good, but you know, this is something. This shows a ball dropping from the top. But there's something that's pretty obviously wrong with it, and that is it falls off the bottom of the screen. And maybe that's fine. Maybe that's what you want in your animation. That's totally up to you. It's totally cool. But my guess is that a common I don't know, choice is going to be that you want something to happen when it reaches the bottom here. And so this is where the value of if statements comes back. So we're going to revisit the if statements that we learned about in the last video. So let's think about this. Again, reading through the code real quick, line by line, I create my circle y variable up here. I set its value to height times 0.25, 0.25, whatever, in the setup function. Then I draw my circle in the draw function, and then finally I add 1 to my circle y variable at the end of draw. Now, the problem is that when circle y keeps increasing, it starts out at like 100, then it's 101, it's 102, 103, 104, 105, blah blah blah, all the way down to when it's 397, 398, 399, 400, 401, 402. The challenge is that as that value increases, it eventually goes off the bottom of the canvas here. So I can write an if statement that checks for that condition. I can say, in this case, if circle y is greater than, and maybe just for funsies, I'll use an arbitrary number here first. I'll say 300. Then I want to what? What do I want to do? In this case, maybe what I'll do is I'll set circle y equal to some other number. Maybe I'll put it right back at the top. Circle y equals 0. So let me run this and see what happens. Actually, first, let me talk through the code. So in draw, every frame, I take the circle y variable and I add 1 to it. Then I have an if statement that says if circle y is greater than 300. So as soon as you hit like 301, then reassign that circle y variable to 0. Okay, now that we've walked through it, let's kind of run it. So it's increasing by 1 each time. It's all good. And then it gets to 300 and it triggers that if statement and it pops back up to the top because circle y is now 0. And now my animation sort of loops or restarts or whatever word you want to use. Now I use an arbitrary number here just to kind of show you, to make it a little bit more obvious what was happening, but generally what you're going to do is use a variable here. So what I'm saying is if circle y is greater than height, now make circle y 0. So the logic is the same. I'm just using the variable instead of a hard-coded number. And so now it'll wait until it's all the way down at the bottom. There are other tricks you can play. So, for example, if I wanted to wait until it was off like the very edge, right now, because circle Y sort of stores the center of the circle, what I'm doing is saying when the center of the circle goes off the bottom of the canvas, then pop it up to the top. Um, I can change that. I can say circle Y, when circle Y is greater than height plus some number. I've used 100 here, so I'm going to use 50 here because that's my radius. So now I'm waiting until circle Y is greater than height plus 50, so just a little bit more. So it waits until it's really off the real bottom of the canvas, and then similar idea here. Instead of popping it up back to the very top, I'll pop it up back to like a little bit above that, so that now it's much smoother and it waits until it's off the bottom, and then it resets it to be actually above the top of the canvas. So the boundary is just a little bit bigger than the actual canvas. But for the sake of talking about it, I think I'll stick with the sort of the edges like I was before. Okay, so now you know how to create an animation, and you know how to use if statements to trigger some change, generally resetting, based on some specific condition. So in this case, when my ball falls off the bottom, then I reset it back to the top. That's one thing we can do, but maybe you want to do other things. So in this case, I'm sort of resetting the state of my sketch, or I am kind of popping the ball like back to the top of my canvas. What if instead I wanted it to bounce? When it reaches the bottom, I want it to bounce back and go towards the top. And there are a few ways I can do this, but the way I like to think about this is I will introduce a new variable. So I'll create my variable up here. I'll call it y speed for now. And I could give it a value there, but I think I'm going to give it a value here just so everything's kind of next to each other. And I'm going to set it equal to 1 for now. That's my that's the default that I'm using here. And okay, so I have y speed variable and I set it equal to 1. And now I'm going to use that y speed variable here. So I'm using this variable in the calculation of my new value for circle Y. Nothing has actually changed yet. I haven't actually introduced any new different code. I've just used a variable instead of that hard-coded value. So if I run this, nothing should change. My circle is still doing its own thing. But the idea is that because of this line of code, because I am setting circle Y equal to whatever the previous value of circle Y is plus y speed, now instead of changing circle Y here, I can change y speed. And let's see what that looks like. Y speed equals, I'll set it equal to, let's say -2, actually. And we'll see what this does. Let's just run it and see. So now my circle is increasing by 1 each time, and now it hits the bottom, and now you see that it bounces back up, and it actually bounces back faster because I'm setting y speed equal to -2. So now the next time the draw is called, when we hit this line, I say, take the circle Y variable and set it equal to whatever the circle Y variable was before, plus y speed, which is plus -2, which is -2. And you know, I chose -2 here just to show you that it doesn't have to be the same, but for the sake of this, I think maybe I will keep it the same. And let me run that and see what happens. Now the ball should kind of bounce like back up, like at the same speed. And okay, cool. Now that's you know, maybe an improvement based on what you want to happen in your sketch, but now I have kind of a similar problem. I have the same problem I did on the bottom, but I have that problem at the top. And so how do I solve that? And the answer is kind of in the same exact way. So there's a few ways to do this. Maybe I'll walk through like doing it the long way, and then maybe I'll shorten it. Yeah, let's do it that way. So right now I have an if statement that checks if circle Y is greater than height And if it is, then y speed should equal -1. And that's what's causing the bounce. But I never bounce it back. So I can add an else if statement here, circle y, else if. So if circle y is not greater than height, then I want to also check for another condition, and that is if it's going off the top of the canvas. So in that case, it's going to be circle y. If circle y is less than 0, then I want to set my y speed back to the original value so that it goes back down. In this case, it's going to be y speed equals 1. And let's run that and see what happens. So now I have my circle. It's bouncing off the bottom, and now it's heading back up because y speed is -1. And now it's going to hit the top. It's going to become less than 0, and y speed is going to go back to 1, which bounces the ball back down. And it's going to, keep that up forever. And all of that is in, these lines of code. I am taking my circle y variable and I am setting it equal to its previous value plus whatever the current speed is. And then based on when my circle goes sort of out of bounds, then I'm changing the speed of the circle. And I broke it down into 2 separate kind of if statements. There's a shorter way to do this, and it's kind of down to personal preference. Honestly, I'm not looking for like code style at this point. I say do whatever makes sense to you. So if this style of if statement makes sense, go for it. But I would generally use a sort of shorthand for all of this, and that is to combine it all into a single if statement, because really you're doing the same thing no matter what. So my if statement will generally look like this. First, I'll have the if statement check if circle y is less than 0, or if circle y is greater than height. So if either one of those things is true, then I want to take circle y, and I want to take y speed, and I want to set it equal to whatever y speed was times -1. So now I'm bouncing it back and forth in a single if statement, and it's a little shorter. I think it's a little easier to read, but totally up to you, totally up to personal preference. So let me run that and see how that works. So now it's bouncing off the bottom, and it should bounce off the top as well. Cool. Yeah, so that is a couple of different things you might do as you create an animation. So one thing I did first was kind of resetting the animation by, in that case, like popping the circle back to the top by resetting my variables or resetting the state of my sketch. The other thing you can do is kind of bounce it off the edges of the screen. It really comes down to personal preference. Whatever effect you're going for is going to decide what kind of code you write. But those are 2 approaches that you might take. Let's see. So there's a couple things I could talk about next. I think next, maybe I'll just kind of expand on this. And right now I have a circle that bounces up and down. And that's great, beautiful, wonderful. If that's what you're going for, then cool, mission accomplished. But let's say I want to keep expanding this. I want to maybe, I don't know, maybe I want it to bounce left and right as well. And I can do that by following the same pattern that I followed so far, and that is to create variables that hold the state of my sketch and then change those variables over time. So yeah, let me just do it, I think. Let's add a circle x variable, and I'll add an x speed variable as well. And I'll give those values down here. Circle x equals, kind of doesn't matter, but for now I'll just say width times 0.5. I'll put it right in the middle, times 0.5. And y speed is 1, so let's make x speed, I don't know, 2. So now I have my variables circle x and x speed exactly how I had circle y and y speed. And now let me change that to first use the circle x variable here. And actually, let me just run my code here. I haven't actually used the x speed variable at all, but I just want to check that my code is working how I think it should. And looks like it is. Cool. And now I want to do the exact same thing, but for x. So, and let me rewrite from scratch. So first, I want to move my circle x variable by setting it equal to its previous value, circle x plus x speed. And then I want to have an if statement that says, you know what, actually, let me just run this and see what happens if I don't have the if statement. Let me run that. And now you see that my ball now has an x speed. Now it's moving, and that's cool. But I don't have my if statement yet, so that part's not working yet, which is fine because that's kind of what I expected. So I'm going to do the same thing I did for y, but for x. So I'm going to say if circle x is less than 0, or circle x is greater than width, then I am going to reverse the sign of my x speed variable. X speed equals x speed times -1 in that case. I think that's right. Let's run it and find out. So now I have my circle bouncing off the right edge, off the top edge, the left edge, and I think that is working. I think because I've chosen 1 and 2, I think it's always going to kind of bounce in the same corners, and that's, you know, maybe not the most exciting thing. So I can now play with these a little bit more. Maybe I'll say 2 and 3. And you know, I will let you decide whether that sparks joy or not, but you can come up with your own numbers or use the random function, for example, to come up with random numbers. That could be fun, but the idea is that to create an animation, the first thing I do is create a variable, or often multiple variables, to hold the state of my sketch. And then I use those variables. Well, first of all, I give those variables values. Then I use those variables to draw my sketch, to draw a single frame of my sketch. And then I change those variables, because that means that when the next frame comes around, which will happen 1/60th of a second later, now I have new values for my state, for my variables. Okay, we're just about done, I think. Maybe the one thing I will mention is, you know, I'm drawing a circle in this example just because it's kind of straightforward. It's two variables. There are many other things you can do. So maybe I don't like to shamelessly self-promote too much, but if you want to see other examples of things you can do, go to happycoding.io, go to the examples section, go here to P5JS, and scroll down a little bit to the animation section. And so here are some other examples that use all of the concepts that I just talked about to do different things, to show stuff that's not just a circle bouncing around the screen. So I don't know, here's an example. Here's an example that fills the screen with a line that falls from the top. And again, I'll let you decide whether it's art or not, but the idea is very similar to what we just looked at. We create some variables at the top, we assign those variables some values, and then we use those variables to draw our scene, and then we modify those variables over time to change what's on the screen. Yeah, maybe not. You know, so there's a bunch of different things you do, and I encourage you to check that out if you want to see something that's not just yet another circle bouncing around the screen. But I'm using the circle just because it's easy. Okay, 2 last things I want to talk about. I'm looking at my handy dandy to-do list over here. Two last things I want to talk about before I close it out. One is, so far, what I've done every frame is, well, what I've done every time draw is called, is I've drawn a completely new frame. Specifically, I draw a background that's gray, and then I draw a circle at whatever the current position of the circle is. And that works well for this kind of animation, for an animation where it's kind of like the movie example we saw earlier, where every frame is its own standalone image. And so if that's the kind of thing you're going for, then everything I just described will work really well for that. Because the first thing you do when you call draw is you call background, which clears out the previous frame. Now, there's another kind of animation, and actually the one I just showed you with the line thing is an example of this, where you don't want the new frame to throw the old frame away. You don't want it to be completely standalone. You want it to sort of add up over time. You want to, I don't know, you think of it maybe as P5 being a little painter inside your computer. Right now, what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, P5, create, well, not create, but draw over whatever you have on your canvas with a gray background, and then draw a new thing, draw a circle. And you're telling the painter inside of P5 to do that 60 times a second. Draw a background, draw a circle, draw a background, draw a circle, draw a background, draw a circle. The other thing to do is to not draw the background, to tell P5, draw this new frame right on top of whatever your old frame was. So let me do that. Let me just get rid of this call to background. So now in the draw function, which again is called 60 times a second, I draw a circle, and then I move the circle, basically. And I do that 60 times a second. And now I'm no longer drawing a background. So let's see what that looks like. And yeah, you see that you get this kind of artifact, which is a result of never clearing out the old frames. My numbers are maybe not super satisfying because maybe 2 and 3 wasn't the best choice, but let me maybe change this because it's going to annoy me. But the idea is that now 60 times a second, you are drawing a circle and you're moving the circle, but you're not erasing the old circle. You're not drawing over it with the background. So you see all of the previous frames, or more specifically, you see the new frame sort of drawn right on top of the old frame. And this is another technique. It's completely up to you, however you want your code to work. That kind of decides what you actually do here. Like, there's no right or wrong, is what I'm trying to say. Drawing a background every frame, not drawing a background every frame, kind of depends on, your goal, but it's a technique. And the other thing you can do is actually, I can draw a background right at the very beginning. So maybe I'll make like, I'll stick with gray. So now I do have a gray background, but since I only draw it once at the very beginning because it's in setup, I'm not drawing that background again every single time draw is called. You still see the old frame sticking around. So again, just something you can add to your sort of tool set. And there's no right or wrong answer, but if you wanted something more like this, then the way to achieve this is to not call background in draw. Okay, this is getting a little long, but the very last thing I wanted to talk about is sort of shortcuts. So the code I wrote here works, and if this if this style of code makes sense to you, then stick with it. I think that's totally fine. But if you look for like example code online, or if you look at other code I've written, you'll see other like shortcuts in the code, and I want to explain them so that when you see them, you're not super confused by them. And here's an example. This line of code, which says circle x equals circle x plus x speed, this kind of code where you're taking a variable and you're setting it equal to itself plus some other number, that line of code is so common that there's actually a shortcut for it. And so instead of saying circle x equals circle x plus x speed, I can shorten that to circle x plus equals x speed. and it works the same. It does the exact same thing. It's just a shortcut for this slightly longer line of code. So you'll see this style of code pretty often. Let's see, where else can I do this? Similar idea here, x speed equals x speed times -1. That kind of thing is done so often that you can actually do times equals -1 here, which is the exact same thing. It's saying take x speed and set it equal to itself times -1. It's just a shortcut. It's just syntactic sugar. You can do it the other way. You can do it like this, but if you want your code to be a little shorter, then you can do it this way. The other thing I'll mention is because this is kind of throwing off my animation, but let me stop this. Here's another line of code that's super common. This is not going to make a lot of sense for my exact animation here, but just to demonstrate, this line of code is so common. Adding 1 to a variable is such a common thing to do. Right now it's just going to kind of go off the edge, and yeah, fine. But anyway, this line of code is so common that there's a shortcut for it, which is circle x plus plus. And circle x plus plus is a line of code. It's a shortcut for what I just wrote, which is take circle x and add 1 to it. And that'll work fine. There's other things, minus minus will work, or minus equals, but the idea is that there are shortcuts for some of these lines of code. I'm actually not sure if this is in the reference. Let's find out. No. Okay. If you use your favorite search engine to look for some of that syntax, it's out there, but the idea is if you see something like this, or if you see something like this, it's a shortcut for reassigning a variable. Okay, I think that's where I'm going to end it. That was kind of a longer one, but thanks for sticking with me. We talked about a lot. We talked about animation and the kind of the general idea of animation in sort of film and TV shows and cartoons and stuff. And then we codified that by creating a set of variables at the very top, and that represents the state of our sketch. And then we set those variables equal to some starter values. And then we use those variables, or that state, to draw something to the screen. And then we change it. We change that that state, or we change those variables every time draw is called, which happens 60 times a second. And because that kind of loop continues on repeat, as I change my state over time, that means that what I'm drawing to the screen changes over time. And because we have human brains that love pattern recognition, we see it as an animation. Okay, I'm stopping there. I'll maybe redirect you back to happy coding, because I know that seeing a circle bounce around is, maybe kind of cool, but probably not what you're here for. So check out the examples section, go to P5, and then scroll down to animations. And here are some other examples that do, more things. But the ideas are going to be the same, where you have your state, you use your state to draw something, and then you change your state. Following that pattern will get you pretty far and let you create some beautiful animations. So I'm excited to see what y'all create, but I've been talking for an hour, so I'm going to end it there. Say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.